The illustrious Jabba bids you welcome. I'm going to regret this.
I'm Pete Mitchell. He's Peyton Jones. And this is the Church Planter Podcast, brought to you by Church Planter Magazine.
All right, so welcome to the Church Planter Podcast. I'm Pete Mitchell.
And I'm Peyton Jones.
Has it been that long that we don't even know how to start our own podcast?
Yeah, pretty much.
Is there like a delay?
I mean, the world's falling apart, Pete.
Dude.
Yeah, there is. It's that Facebook Live stuff. It's a streaming.
It probably is the Facebook Live stuff and I'm using a wireless internet because I'm on a different computer.
Yeah, me too.
So who knows?
It's the end of the world, man. This is like as primitive as Robinson Crusoe.
By the way, why are you trying to look like a Sith Lord right now?
Because it's cold. I'm in my office. I'm writing. I'm on this textbook project.
Oh my gosh. Can we please hear about the textbook?
Fiddling with the textbook as Rome burns.
Yeah.
The world's falling apart, and I'm writing a textbook.
The Republic is dead.
Typical.
As I've been saying all day long on Facebook. In fact, my wife just came home. I was telling Peyton.
Insert political rant here.
Oh, dude. I was telling Peyton right before we started the podcast that my mom has been texting me and my wife, and I don't think she was expecting the response from me that she was getting. So, because I'm like, first of all, I think everything that's going on right now is illegal, unconstitutional, a trial run for some evilness that they're going to be doing later. I am not.
The opinions expressed by Pete Mitchell on this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of this podcast.
I'm trying to rein myself in. It's so hard right now. And I'm like going off, like back and forth with my mom via text. And my wife, she just comes home from the park. And she looks at me and she goes, yeah, I've been getting a pretty good chuckle out of your your text with your mom. I'm like, don't poke the bear today. Don't poke the bear today.
Everybody's obviously a bit on edge. And, our whole reason, Pete and I aren't here to do a full-length podcast by any means. Obviously, like we put the podcast on hold for, easily a month. Doesn't have to do with the coronavirus. And Pete reached out today and he's like, hey, we should probably really let our listeners know why we're not broadcasting because they're going to think we died, right? Which would be a terrible rumor and cool at the same time. Could sell a bunch of albums like the Beatles when Paul McCartney was supposedly dead.
I wonder if anyone would care if we died. Like,
nobody
that's really
would care.
my genuine question.
My books would take off, though. That'd be great. I would sell tons of books.
You think?
No.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, well, why don't we start? We want to do two things on this podcast. We want to tell you why we're taking a little bit of a sabbatical for probably about 4 weeks. Because if you've been noticing, all of a sudden we went from all these podcasts to radio silence. We're going to tell you why we're taking a bit of a sabbatical. The podcast is not going away forever. It is just a temporary thing. We'll tell you why. And then we also want to take a couple of minutes and just kind of address the coronavirus and how the church is responding to it. And Peyton and I have not discussed this. And I told him, I go, look, I think the church is screwing this up. So we may have a difference of opinion, and who knows where this thing is going to go. And Peyton goes, I got to be honest, I'm a little bit upset with some pastors right now. So we don't know where each other stands on any of that. But Peyton, why don't you tell them why we're taking the sabbatical first, and then we'll get into the other.
Well, it's my fault. So basically, I mean, I'm in crunch time with this textbook, so that's one of the reasons it's going to be very short. But yeah, I'm in crunch time with the textbook. I'm at the very end. So like I had Don Stoner, in helping yesterday with the bibliography at Bo Moffitt, helping with the index. I'm at that time now, and I'm considering like maybe even getting editorial help to help with the textbook, just because I change it all the time. I mean, I'm like Jeff Buckley trying to nail down tracks for an album. They couldn't nail them down, and I literally revamped my chapters again over the weekend like an idiot, like a month before the manuscript comes out. So, or I have to hand it in. So, the other thing is, I'm like, my brain is cooked. Like I'm gone. Like I'm trying. Someone asked me yesterday, so what do you think about all this stuff? And to be honest, this is disappointing for you guys, but I'm like, I have no mental margin right now to even process. I'm literally showing up to this thing like, okay, I'll deal with you later. I'm just focused on this manuscript from 6 a.m. to whenever I go to bed.
Why don't you tell them, for the new guy who's joining in, who has no idea what your manuscript's about, tell them what your manuscript's about.
It's about church planning, and it's about 1,000 pages.
It's a textbook on church planning, right? It's like a
textbook
how-to
on church planning. It's huge.
Yeah.
So what a lot of you guys don't realize is when I submitted Church Zero all these years ago, it was part of a greater textbook that later became parts of Jump School. Not all of it, but I had planned, and Reaching the Unreached. Like I had like a manifesto on church planning that I had written primarily to train planners. That's what I did, before I left Wales. I was with a guy named Di Hankey, and that's where Jump School originally started. And we were training back then. And so when I got back to America, I was like, I'm writing all this stuff down. And so I'm still doing that, but so much of this is new content that if it were as simple as just taking everything I'd written over the last 10 years and binding it, that would have been rad, job done. But for the last like 5-6 months, all I've done is make what I had better or write completely new content.
Yeah.
So I'm at the end now. So if you're coming on new to the pie, by the way, couple things. Let's do some house cleaning at the same time. I had someone reach out to me for hardcore this week and ask me, hey, are you still in the podcasting world? Let me kind of tell you what's going on with me. Number one, hardcore took a break. And what we decided, Pete and I, was we would start bringing interviews on here. So if you go back to our last few episodes, we're doing interviews. I also started another podcast with my wife and Barry Waters that we make fun of Barry all the time on this podcast. But he was one of my church planning partners over there, came over as my intern a few years ago, married Ruben's sister, and then went back to Wales, and they're getting ready to plant another church. So in a coffee house. So he had done that before. He's getting ready to do it again. And so I do a podcast not on church planning. It's called Ministry Ninja. We talk over everything. We talked religion and politics. We talked over, we did talk the coronavirus. And now that's on hold for a month. And then just because I got to do this, the textbook. So, but other than that,
and if you want to get goodness from Pete Mitchell, which is really the reason people listen to the Church Planner podcast. I mean, let's face it, it's for Pete. Literally just launched the other day the Thriving Christian Business podcast. I do it with Dave Negri. We've got the first 3 episodes on there. By the way, or maybe 4, I don't remember exactly. I know we just recorded the 5th, but the 3rd episode was strangely prophetic in that it's called The Economy, Your Economy, God's Economy. And we really talk about the differences between all 3 of those. And that's, a primary thing of what's going on right now. And then the episode we actually just recorded yesterday, which is going to air next Monday, I believe, is all about, it's the craziness of the coronavirus and how it's affecting business and what you need to do as a Christian business owner that is affected by coronavirus. And then another podcast I do with a church planner in Ohio. I do it with Dan Sams. It's called From Concealment. It's all about guns, ammo, craziness, and it's probably one of my funnest podcasts. In fact, I think we're going to rename it the Tinfoil Hat Podcast because Dan Sams is just a character, to say the least. And we actually just recorded yesterday an episode on what we think are some of the darker underlying things going on with the coronavirus with our government. And that one's airing next Monday. So those are 2 that you might want to check out. During our brief sabbatical from the Church Planner podcast. And it is brief because we are coming back. We're not hanging up the Church Planner podcast. We're absolutely coming back. But those are two that you can check out in the meantime. Thriving Christian Business Podcast and From Concealment. From Concealment, you just might have fun with it because it's not really about God, church planning. It's just we got a pastor in it and we got me in it. So we always kind of take that road, which will be interesting too to see how God uses that because of some of the people who've reached out to me, after hearing, because Dan Sam's like you, Peyton, he can't turn it off, right? I mean, he's a Jesus lover. I don't mean like I can turn it off, but I mean like he's going to share the gospel every chance he gets, and he takes advantage of that on the podcast as well, which is actually kind of awesome. So
yeah, and one other thing is there's one other podcast that I started doing, which is Exponential Reproducing Churches podcast. That has been interviews with guys that are planting out, multiplying, and it's the top 100 multiplying churches in America. We have literally taken Outreach Magazine's articles, which was done in partnership with Exponential. And so we're doing the podcast for that. And I host that. And so I get to interview. I got to be honest, like every single interview for that has been phenomenal. If you've not checked that out, it's the Exponential Reproducing Churches podcast. And so it's not like I haven't been podcasting, but I did some of them in advance. So anticipating that this last month would be like just run around with my hair on fire.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's just to let you guys know what's going on with the podcast. And we will be back, in 3-4 weeks, somewhere around that time frame. And so the Church Planner podcast is on sabbatical. It is our 7 years. So it's our
7-year birthday. It's crazy. So it's fitting that we take a sabbatical.
Yeah, absolutely. But so we're not going away. We're taking sabbatical, and then we'll be back. And we've got plenty of other resources that you can take advantage of in the meantime. So Peyton, let's get into it because I know you don't have much time.
I got about 10 minutes and then I got to shoot.
Your thoughts on the church and coronavirus, and let me know what you're thinking.
So a couple things, and I'll make this kind of quick. So I think that the pastors have scrambled to get online. It has to be kind of raising a very disturbing question, and that is, why would people come back once we go this route and people aren't able to join us? And now they're watching the show. If you watch the broadcasts of mega churches, I tuned into a couple of them on Sunday. There was about 40 people in churches of thousands online watching, which tells me people are saying, you know what, I don't really need to watch the show. I'm off with my family. I'm going to go do something else. And I would imagine that, if we talk about redundancy in corporations, the church is being made redundant. And this is part of what I was saying in Church Zero. Cha-ching! Back in the beginning of Church Zero, about 10 years ago, I wrote that pretty soon people are going to figure out that they might as well just stay home on a Sunday because church does not offer them anything that they can't get online. So, I could pick John MacArthur. I could pick, I wouldn't, but I could pick Alistair Begg. I could pick Chuck Smith or whoever Louis Giglio, and listen to whoever in the heck I want on a Sunday and do whatever in the heck, that's where people are. I could put a worship CD on. What the church alone can provide, but our churches aren't wired for it, is what missional communities tapped into. And what, with Church Zero, I just said, look, interaction was the name of the game in the New Testament. So if your church is not hardwired for interaction, which I would say, is the spiritual gifts, is what I argue biblically, that you can't do in a megachurch scenario, staring at the back of someone's head, that this is, everybody's like, this is good for the church. I don't see how. I actually don't see how, unless what happens is the church, what I think this has done has exposed the weakness that's been there, and that this is going to be a tipping point for the church where the weaknesses is so far exposed. Like, this changes everything as far as I'm concerned. I think we will have a drive when people decide to go back to church. And I know this has got pastors shaking in their boots. I think it's going to cause people to ask, well, you know what, during this time on the quarantine and the lockdown, what I couldn't get was fellowship. When I go back to church, that's what I want. I don't want to just watch such and such pastor on stage. I mean, he was doing that the whole time, strangely, rather than in his living room. He was up on stage with all these lights and pyrotechnics, whatever that was about. Like, you got to have all that behind you to simply share the gospel. I mean, I just think it's exposing the shenanigans and the craziness that the church has been up to for a while. So I can only speak into the church side of things as far as the coronavirus. You and I are in different places as far as I'm like, hey, if this is going to stop the spread, and, I have an immunocompromised daughter. My daughter's best friend is immunocompromised. I have friends with HIV. It's not just old people that like eating with their lung disease and different things like that. She's a lot more susceptible to pneumonia than the average bear. And so I don't personally have a hard time with stopping it as an RN and just saying, we're just going to relax,
right.
And chill. It's hard, but yeah.
My issue with that is actually, I think if you have that type of situation, then you self-quarantine. I have a huge problem with them trampling on our constitutionally protected God-given rights. That's where I have a huge issue with it. I'm gonna actually read here something from a guy I know. His name is Chris Neiswander. I knew him from apologetics.com when I was on their board for years. He's an apologist. He's a pastor. Used to be here in California. He's moved out to the East Coast to pastor a church out there. He's also got his law degree. I don't know if he's passed the bar or not. I don't know if he's taken the bar. I have no idea. But I know he's literally one of the smartest guys I know. And he wrote this piece on Facebook. And to me, I was like, this is speaking directly to the heart of the issue. So he wrote this: "We will not cancel the ordained worship service of the church upon the command of the state or any of its agents. The supposed reasonableness of an illegal command is never the primary issue. The issue is the head of state's authority to direct the church upon the justification of public necessity. A directive has been given to the people of God that they not go to church by the governor of the state, which is plainly an unconstitutional overreach of state power imposed upon the church, which neither constitution nor regard for the inherent authority and rights of the church. The church is not part of the state. It is not under the authority of the state. It's not subject to the powers of the state. There's a good reason that Madison wrote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the freedoms thereof as a prohibition of state coercion of the church. Be careful what you establish as a precedent for the expression of state power. Administrations change, and so does what is considered a public necessity. To speak frankly, the church does not have a duty to obey the state, but for in matters of incidental to its work. What occurred in Mississippi is the worst type of infringement. The state acted to cancel the church services of every church in Mississippi by commanding its citizens to not attend church, a directive given under the color of authority. The argument in favor of this exercise of the authority of the state over the church seems to be one that agrees that the state is demanding a wise course of action. But agreement with the reasoning isn't the same as agreeing with authority of the state over the church. It's different than agreeing that the state has the actual authority to make this kind of decision or demand compliance. At the point, you might well be arguing for state church or church as a subsidiary department of the state, something that most of you loathe ideologically. The worship of God is not a thing to be lightly disregarded, as with basketball games and visits to the bars, California. God takes it very seriously, as its purpose is the spiritual well-being of his people, and he at times provides consequences for its avoidance. If one believes that God has ordained his worship at a specific time and place, no force on earth can legitimately counter his intent. This, of course, a matter of Christian conscience and dependent upon one's understanding of God and the Bible, but the exercise of that conscience is protected by the law of the land. As for where and how one could easily perform one's duty to God in a field, in a building, with soft seats, with warm colors, one could not avoid worship in any other way than by a divine command. Still, necessity is also a command, and there's good evidence in the Bible that God allows the sick and contagious, the infirm, for those whom attendance is impossible to stay home. But that is the judgment of the church and not the state. Do you really want the state telling you when you can go to church? The state is God's state. The church is God's church, but the church is not the state's church. There is a delicate separation of balance of powers here, and the state does not have the power or authority greater than the church. That the state has greater authority than the church might be one of the great myths of the American sentiment. The state is distinct and different, but no greater or wiser. In fact, the state is generally the less wise of the two. Given the opportunity, the church will make the best possible decision for the health, safety, and well-being of her members, and the state is afforded neither the authority nor the right to make such decisions. So the argument being made is this: the state can cancel your church service anytime it feels it has a good enough reason. I say no, they can't. So does the Constitution, so does Scripture. With Peter, when commanded not to preach, we say, shall we obey men rather than God? The issue is that they lack the authority to issue any such command, and that they have the authority to tell a Christian when they should and should not go to church is worse than legally false. It's positively heretical. Now, I know that you're saying that I know you're not saying that. You're arguing the reasonableness of the command, but the reasonableness of an illegal command is never the primary issue. And so churches will tell Christians when it's morally acceptable to attend or not attend church, not governors or princes or presidents or kings. We have it because we have a greater king with whom to contend, and he will broke no rivals. So anyway, that to me, it just speaks volumes, because as you know, I do agree the state has no authority. They have no authority to shut down business that they're doing. This is all illegal, all unconstitutional. But I was thinking about this. I'm like, how do you get the church to stop meeting? Well, if you commanded the church and you said, you guys can't meet anymore, Christians would band together and say, no, we can't. So What do? First of all, we have this scare, and then they ask us, oh, would you please not meet anymore? And by the way, if you do meet, like the mayor of LA, if you do meet, we're going to shut off your power. I mean, there's a movie I saw years ago, and I don't remember what the name of it was, but I remember the guy was like a Navy SEAL or something, and the president wanted to talk to him, and he didn't know that the president was, really the bad guy behind it all, and, he had his gun on him, so the Secret Service goes, hey, we need your gun. He goes, okay, gives him his gun. And their line was, how do you get a gun away from a Navy SEAL? You have to ask for it. How do you get the church to not meet? You just have to ask them to not meet. And that's the danger that I see of what's going on right now, man. I mean, like you talked about, people are going to go, why do I need to go back to that thing? I mean, I could watch it online. And realistically, what do you do when you're watching stuff online? Not really paying attention. You got everything else going on.
Like this podcast.
Yeah, right? Well, I mean, one of the things that you've said for years, Peyton, there's 3 reasons that we have church. One is to hear from God. One is to hear from each other. Wait, give them to me again. I just had it on the tip of my tongue. To hear from God. To hear
from God, for God to hear from us,
there you
for
go.
us to hear from each other.
Yeah. And we're not doing that. I mean, we're social beings.
No, I got you.
And as much as I hate people, and I'm like, dude, I've been planning for this quarantine my whole life. Like, I'm prepped up, baby. I got food for days. I'm ready. But we're social beings.
So, to that end, one of the ways that as we go into this and we're doing a online, you can't run an online service when people aren't in the room with 30 minutes of singing and a 40 minute sermon. You need to do snippets. If you're gonna do an online format, there needs to be kind of like the old school liturgy, like a reading, a prayer, a 5 to 10 minute thing on scripture, a song you share, to keep it moving. Because when people are watching online, there's a different dynamic. Yeah. Think social media, think short attention span. You've got to change your format of communicating. There has to be a different liturgy, to use that word. Can't be 30 minutes of singing. If you talk to any pastor that tracked the views, they were lost by the time the sermon came because people got bored. They're not in a room worshiping together. Why would you put 30 minutes of music on?
Right.
That it's not the same, right? So even the way we're so glued to our structures, but speaking into your point, I agree with what he's saying in principle, but I don't agree with it in this situation. I don't, and I realize like we have different opinions, and I'm glad that there's people that think from that angle and say, hey, what about our rights, and what about, that's always important as an American. I guess the way that I come out of this is, yeah, you can have my gun right now, like metaphorically as a Navy SEAL. You can have my ability to not meet, because I know we're meeting again, and nothing will stop us from meeting again. And that's the power I hold as a minister. But for this, I take a servant position, and I say to not the state, it's not the state that I'm speaking to. It's actually my society, my fellow man, that I turn as the church and say, if we as an institution are the only institution still meeting when they've closed bars and pubs and restaurants and schools, that stands out to me. If you play that out, that stands out as undermining every sacrifice that everyone else has made. And the church becomes known for refusing to make that sacrifice to serve their culture and fellow man. And so for me, I have the power, but it's meekness. I've decided to submit and bend the neck. Meekness is not weakness. The church is strong. The church will be able to rise up. And the church has always been a threat to the powers and the government. I mean, back in the book of Acts, the persecution, I always try to tell people this. If you read the book of Acts, about 5 times it says the common people heard them gladly, or they grew in the esteem of men. The church got the respect of the people because it was sacrificing, because it was ministering during the famine. But where the church was persecuted, if you notice in the book of Acts, it's only by the authorities and the powers. So we very much know that at a certain point, it could come to a head, and the church, the kingdom of God, is always the greatest threat to the kingdoms of the earth. It's always been that way. It's why communists, they always ban the church. First thing they do, we don't believe in God. It's illegal to believe in God. We ban the church. So the church, and Colson did this amazing work on this with the overthrow of the Berlin Wall and communism in Eastern Europe in a book called The Body, where he very well documents that the underground church was largely instrumental in overthrowing that. I'm never worried. The civil rights movement shows the power of the church against government. We are the sleeping giant. And if you wake us, that is a problem. However, at the same time, right now, I think we need to take a servant posture with culture and be leading out in sacrifice and saying, we will do this temporarily. We're not laying down our constitutional rights. We're serving our fellow man, and the two are different. We're not doing this for you, government. We're doing this for the people around us and for the witness of Christ, that we will be seen to serve our brothers and sisters outside of the church, in hopes of winning them. So that's kind of where I'm at with that.
Yeah, no, I get what your point is. I definitely do. I think it's one of those things that we got to be careful of.
Yeah, we do. And I'm glad someone's watching that, because, that guy, you can't refute any of his points. What he's saying is 100% right. And someone's got to be paying attention to that, because when and if something like that is an issue, you will need that reasoning and argumentation. I just don't know that it fits this particular context. The motive behind it, if that makes sense. I see even, Trump, who was convinced, hey, this is a hoax, now turning around and saying that we need to do every single thing we can. And so I think people's minds.
Well, I personally, I think that's literally the hysteria. The stats that they're sharing with us, if their stats are true, are not bearing out a reason for the hysteria. Yeah. Do people who are infirmed have a greater risk of dying? Absolutely, because they are already infirmed. They already had a greater risk. That's life. The stats aren't
isn't it
out.
right now? Isn't it at 10? Like what's the word I'm looking for? Increments of what's the word I'm looking for? It's exponential to the 10th power. So it's like if it's 100 cases today in 10 days, it goes to 1,000, and 10 days later from that it goes to 10,000, and then 10 days later from that it goes to 100,000. That's so in 30 days, if we had 100 cases, we'd be at 100,000 cases. And so with that kind of spread, exponentials of 10, we're looking, or factors that I'm not a math guy. I just was talking to Don Stoner. Dude's crazy smart. He was doing the math. He helped invent the compact discs. So, he's a scary science man. And he mentioned math. And, speaking of which, Pete, no, I'm teasing. That's my signal to get off.
That would be hilarious.
When you're doing all this self-isolating, you can't go pick up the offering, Pete. And, during that time, it sure is helpful to have someone like SimplifyChurch.com.
Wait, who's this?
SimplifyChurch.com.
Wow.
They'll do all of your online bookkeeping, Pete.
And I don't even have to go see them? You mean I could do it online?
It's all virtual. They provide virtual assistance the whole 9 yards, Pete.
That's so awesome.
And 7 years in, we're still laughing at our own ads, right?
Oh my gosh. I can't
wondering why no sponsors
there.
love us.
That's the best, man. That's the best ever.
Well, hey, guys, thanks for joining us today. We just didn't want to leave you hanging because it's been a couple weeks, going to be like 4 more weeks till you see us. So I guess total is going to be like 6 weeks, right? And Pete was just very concerned about you. I wasn't. I read one of our reviews last week, and I was dying because a guy goes, "You never know what these guys are going to say," and he puts in parentheses, especially Peyton. And I'm thinking, how did we get here? How did this change? Because this was always like, you never know what Pete's going to say on this thing, But
that makes me smile. Maybe he doesn't recognize our voices, and that could be it.
That has to be because, every once in a while I have to get on the phone with your parents and tell them I'm looking after him, which is like legit. Honestly, I see his parents at least once a year, and I have to tell them that, I'll keep looking after him.
Yeah, they keep saying to me, "We're so grateful that you're friends with Peyton." I'm like, I'll always be that kid.
I know it. I'm always Wally. Never Eddie Haskell. I don't know what happened. But somehow I'm the Wally Cleaver. So
that's the way it goes.
It is. Well, hey guys, thanks for joining us today. This has been Peyton and Pete reminding you, if you want to reach the ones no one's reaching, you need to go where nobody. I can't say that anymore. Stay in your house. Don't go anywhere. Self-quarantine. And that's it.
All right, guys. We'll be back in like 4 weeks. Talk to you then. Take care,
See
everybody.
you then. Bye.
Thanks for joining us for another weekly episode of the Church Planner Podcast with Pete Mitchell and Peyton Jones. We'd love to hear your comments on this episode of the Church Planner Podcast. Visit us online and let us know what you thought at churchplannerpodcast.com. If you subscribe to us via iTunes and have enjoyed the podcast, leave us a positive review. The more positive reviews we receive in iTunes, the more iTunes will promote us to other church planners who would benefit from this show. This podcast is brought to you by the Church Planner Magazine, which is available in the iTunes newsstand or online via churchplannermagazine.com.